This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is titled Build Fast and Break Things. So in this episode, Mike's going to talk about sort of I don't know if it's a meme, a slogan, a mantra, whatever, of basically Silicon Valley, more or less. So we hear this all the time, and it's like, hey, Silicon Valley, they go fast and break things, and that's why, our tech works, doesn't work, it kind of works, disappears, gets replaced, gets cannibalized quickly, things move on, the things you love get destroyed, things you love get built. It's all over the place. It's kind of a little bit of chaos. And so we're going to be discussing that, I'm sure, through the lens of a web developer. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go check us out on that Patreon, leave a review rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. Now, Mike, you have a lot to say on this topic. Build fast, break things, and I think we're going to have a little bit of a debate, because I'm more of the, let's calm it down, let's see what's up, take your time, you're not in a rush, and let's, build something cool. But I will admit that there's, you can go too far. So what do you think about this whole build fast, break things sort of slogan, if you will?
Yeah, I think it has some negative connotations at this point, because I feel like all software that we've interacted with in the past 10 years is probably in this area of people's minds, is like everything's kind of broken. I have some arguments against that mindset, because in my opinion, regardless of people's approaches, currently in the last 10 years, 20 years landscape of software, like regardless of how perfect you think your software is, it's still going to be broken. So my thought is, like, if it's already going to be broken from the get-go to a certain degree, like there's going to be edge cases that you don't catch no matter how good your QA team is, then trying to make it perfect is zero-sum game to a point where it could sink your company. And I have a list of things about what building fast even means, so we'll get into that. I have a list here of why it's okay to break things, like why this, like a little bit of this broken software stuff that we're seeing with smaller companies especially is okay. And like most of us, like a lot of people have embraced it to a certain degree, to the point where like it's kind of a benefit almost. And I'll explain myself there. And then at the end, just to make sure that everyone is understanding, I'm going to tell you when it's not okay. There are a few points where you don't want to break things, right? Like where you do want to make it as close to perfect, or do all your due diligence, add a couple extra steps into your process for these kind of points. And I'll cover them too. So it's not just going to be all about like, break things, make the customer angry and stuff like that. That's not what this is about, really. This is about allowing the development process to occur in the sense that mistakes and issues can happen, right? But have the ability to not impact the customer, like for availability of the product for a long time, have the ability to fix things or roll things back quickly. And I'll get into that whole part about it too. Like having the ability to do this work without making a bad experience for the customer is the point of this conversation. It's not about making it so that you're building so quickly that you don't have time to test, that you don't have time to do anything, and you're just relying on the customer for QA. That's not what this conversation is about.
I was going to say, because this sort of phrase, build fast and make mistakes, get messy, whatever, magic school bus, break things. This sort of idea really is tied to pushing, I guess, technology forward a lot of the time, where people just go full speed. And it's like, well, at least we've pushed forward. Sure, you weren't able to upload a picture to Instagram for a week. I'm just making that up. But you weren't able to upload that image, but, now we know, we've learned some things, or now Instagram is that much faster or whatever. And like, it's interesting to hear that you're doing this with the idea of like, hey, let's not, interrupt, the customer, and let's do this in sort of a more responsible way. It'll be specifically interesting to hear what the point of that is, because any sort of scaffolding, let's say, any sort of overhead, technical overhead, which is, just as simple as taking a backup, that might take a few hours for the backup literally to take and then copy, is, a bit of technical debt in relation to building fast, right? Like, it does slow you down. And so the ability to roll back and, not interrupt people, at least not critically, or at least not for long, is certainly a scaffolded way to build fast. And I haven't really heard that. Usually it's like, we'll get rid of our, QA team, whether literally doing that or partially doing that. We'll get rid of our QA team and we'll wait for the customers to complain that, they can't upload an image, they can't sign in, they can't do this and that, and then we'll just go in and fix it. And so this is an interesting sort of, I almost called it a mini take. I don't know if that's the way to say it, but.
Yeah, it's a different take because like the way that deployment and infrastructure has progressed, we can rely on these kind of rollback systems and backup and restore systems to work better and more autonomously than we did before. So the before times of taking backups with a click of a button and waiting for that 2-hour backup of an entire server are kind of in the past, at least where I'm working, or like with the systems that I'm working. I have rolling backups occurring consistently with how I'm building. Like anytime I build something, a backup occurs. Anything that I do essentially triggers a backup, and not only of like my production environment, but my database and et cetera, et cetera. And I'll get into that like in a second, literally. But one thing I do want to talk about before is like where this episode is coming from and what is causing me to talk about this is that I've seen and personally been a part of teams that have stagnated harshly to the point where like we're trying to put a button in like a checkout of a product. And that process is like a multi-month process. It goes through 7 different teams to get approval for that button and comes back and forth between the developers. Like the developers are barely part of that process, right? Because like they're like the PMs are talking to the marketers, they're talking to the analytics people, etc. But that whole process is what kind of bogs down progress on a product. And that's what I really, really want to talk about, because I've been part of teams that have done that have like, you can't do anything for 2 months, even a button. And I've been part of teams where an issue comes up or a feature is requested and 2 days later it's already in production, right? Like I've been to the both extremes, and trust me, the success level of the 2 days to production has been much higher than the success level of 2 months to a button. Okay. And that's why I think that there needs to be a balance. You need to have checks and balances in place, but being able to ship features and ship bug fixes and have actual feedback be implemented quickly is of high importance to the success of a product. So it's important for your mentality if you're leading a team or if you're being part of a team or you're thinking about getting into web development, even that if your mentality is like, I want to make things quickly, I feel like you're going to bring a lot to a team that has that same mindset. But if you go to a team that's more like stagnated, then you're going to be playing the politics game. And again, that part of the process needs to be thought out very intensely to allow for quick iteration. It's not just development. I would even emphasize that development is a small part of this whole thing. It's really the process from start of, hey, we want this feature to when it's launched. And that involves, well, it could involve 7 departments. Ideally, it involves much less.
Well, you can think about it almost in a way of like a smaller business, or even if it's a solo entrepreneur or something, a solo entrepreneur or whatever they call themselves now, a solo business person. When they're going in and they go, you know what, I'm going to go and, build this website for myself, and maybe I need some e-commerce because I'm selling my, my crafts or something. They're going to go pretty quick, more than likely. They don't really have the money, the time, nor the people to sort of be political with. There's not really that office politics game. And so you're going to go in, you're just going to go and do it. And short of you being busy on, the manufacturing of your crafts, You're going to go in there, add that button, change how things work. And if something breaks, it's more of you just going in there and fixing it no matter what, rather than it being sort of like a stressful, like, oh my God, it took 6 months to approve this. Now something's broken. What do we do? It's certainly a different mentality. Many teams get involved in the sort of office politics game when it's one of the slower teams where, realistically, a lot of time, a lot of paid hours, billable hours were spent on this thing before it even got onto the development floor. It gets developed, and let's say there's a problem with it. And maybe not even from the development side. Like, what if there's a marketing problem where people are confused, they're getting stuck, they don't know how to log in now, they don't know how to check out now, and it works, your internal testing and whatever, but you've been inside of that sort of echo chamber that is your team for so long that, you think it's easy to check out, but, other people might think it's weird that the button is at the bottom the whole time, and then all of a sudden it's at the top left or something like that, right? And now it's like, okay, do we roll this back, or do we take another 6+ months to add another thing? Like, things get really kind of nuanced quickly. I would like to say, though, and like Mike, I'm sure you'd agree, that sometimes like sort of this office politics game and this slow team thing is for good reason. Like something like a change to Windows has a huge implication. Like if you make a mistake in Windows and it starts deleting files, that's really serious, right? Like Windows, Mac OS as well, Linux, certain distros, they're staples of work, right? They're staples of just being a tool that people use every single day to do their work, emails, drawing, art, whatever, making music, it doesn't matter. And if it starts deleting things, if it starts not recording that audio, if it starts not being able to, be drawn on or whatever, that's a serious problem. You're actually halting other developers as well. And so something like a Windows, would move a bit slower, right? And it would require people look at it due to the implications, but also due to the legacy as well, like the legacy code bases. Hey, we need to support these really old applications. We need to support all this old stuff. We need to be able to look at ARM. Like Windows has been struggling with ARM, and I know it's getting better now with the new Snapdragon chips that released recently as of recording this. But look at how much how many attempts it took, and part of that was probably because they were like, x86 has been a part of our blood, really, of Windows for so long that how much time can we afford to go onto this new platform when this one works okay? And, when it doesn't work okay, it's like, how many people want to keep investing in that, right? And so, yes, I understand the computer landscape has changed. Apple has sort of pushed that ball down the hill, if you will, a little bit by, making the M1 through M2, et cetera, chips. And, that's certainly an evolution of computing a bit. But if we take a look, it's like a lot of x86 apps are being tested just in people's reviews. Like, hey, are these x86 apps okay? Because there's that translation layer. And that's a huge implication, right? It's a huge part of it, of having that legacy way back. And so I just wanted to say that because I don't want to sort of poo-poo the people that are in these teams that are slow. Like sometimes the team literally has to be slow because it just does not make sense to go fast. You go fast, you start deleting everything, or there's no UI on Windows, you got a serious problem on your hands.
Absolutely. And I'll have a whole section talking about when it's right to be slow, right? And I'll even mention a very similar example to what you're saying with the Windows as well. And it'll be a different one, so it'll make a different point. But you're absolutely correct, 100%. Where I differ in opinion a little bit, and where I think the Windows team and all the other teams also are starting to realize, is that core infrastructure, you're right. The stuff that people interact with daily, the start menu, et cetera, everything that's launching apps and stuff like that, 100%. But stuff for instance, the calculator app, built-in apps into Windows, those kinds of things that are used externally, that are used outside of your core interaction with Windows, are starting to be packaged outside of Windows. And the reason for that is exactly this. So that teams can build faster, update faster, iterate faster. And that's a core principle in this methodology of building fast. Allowing your core systems to remain core and stable, and then being able to add features or items on top of those systems without directly interacting with the core and disrupting it. It's an architectural decision you have to make early on, and Windows suffered from that for a very long time when, essentially you had to wait an entire update cycle to update a core app, right? Like Notepad and stuff like that. I believe they're starting to come out of that now, where they're starting to pull those apps out of their core and making them separate things that they can update whenever they want without affecting the Windows installation. And that's the mentality that I'm trying to get across here. Is like, yes, an application that, everyone uses, Windows, that is your productivity tool. You touch that, you could, severely impact millions and millions of people. So yeah, you need to put that through 10 extra steps. But something outside of that, something where you can iterate and create something really cool on top of Windows, that should be architected in a way that allows you to build faster, allows you to break things a little bit, as long as it's not breaking core functionality. So that's kind of like first step into this next segment is, what does building fast mean? Is the architecture, like making the architecture allow you to build faster, right? Again, thinking about that prospect of like, okay, you're going to have the core, let's make that slow, and allowing the other parts, the add-ons, to be their own kind of sandbox thing that can't break the core. So then if they can't break the core, that's only breaking itself, you have less risk, therefore allowing you to make more mistakes and allowing you to be more agile, right? And that's one step. Another step is establishing a tech stack that actually allows your teams to iterate quickly. So whether that be for us, Matt and I, or myself especially, we do web development, right? So it's going to be very specific to web development. Like for me, a great iterating tech stack is using SvelteKit. I can build really quickly with it. The dev server is really fast. It builds really quickly. It runs quickly. It deploys quickly. Those kinds of things is what I'm talking about, building, like using a tech stack that can iterate quickly. Not to say that Next.js can't, because it can. I'm just saying that for me, the SvelteKit is the same, but using something that maybe compiles for a long time and has a lot of build tools involved with it. If your build process is 10, 20, 30 minutes, which is not out of the picture, that's pretty ordinary. Sometimes it's an hour, depending on the complexity of your application, what you're bundling. That severely limits your developers to make mistakes. Because any mistake they make, if they want to test it on a dev environment, they're waiting an hour before they get to that point of testing. So then they have to iterate and then wait another hour before they can test again. Boom, you're limiting yourself. You're limiting your team based on a technological choice. If we can test in seconds with a dev server, so anytime you save and all of a sudden everything pops up in milliseconds that you've changed, again, that iteration happens much quicker internally, allowing your team to build faster, right? Now, with that comes also stuff like dev environments, right? Like if you only have a production environment, for instance, if your tech stack only allows for a production environment, then any change you push to production is going to be seen by your customers before you could even like fully quote unquote test it. So you got to make sure that all those changes are perfect. So again, that would severely slow down your development team and make it so that anything that they push is checked, 20, 30, 40 times before it gets pushed up. And then there's still a chance that might break because you're not testing it in a one-to-one environment because there's no dev environment. So the idea is you want to be able to spin up dev environments, multiple potentially. You might want a staging environment, a dev environment. You might want feature branch environments where you can have that server parity between your production and your dev servers to test any of those edge cases that you could be testing without having to affect your actual customers, right? So the ability to quickly spin up dev environments is one thing. Another really important part is if you do deploy to prod after you've been testing on your dev environments and you notice a glitch, you want to make sure your tech stack allows for quick and easy rollbacks. So Matt mentioned earlier that backups being part of the process could actually slow you down. Well, yes, but if you choose the right tech, it'll probably speed you up. So stuff like Vercel has an instant rollback option. So that you don't have to handle anything there. You just have to use Vercel, pay them. So it costs some money to use Vercel in a production environment. But when you're paying them for auto backups and instant rollback. Anything that happens, you have, I believe you can roll back for as long as you want, like immediately to an older build. So that, again, allows your team to make mistakes. So let's say they take down production, it would only be down for a couple of seconds because they check, boom, they instantly roll back. You can even have it set up auto rollbacks where it does a testing suite after you deploy, notices something's wrong, and then immediately rolls back. A lot of options there, again, to allow more agile workflow. You have dev databases. So databases traditionally, people would just have like a local branch or just like maybe even work only in production. Don't get mad at me here. I have evidence. I've talked to someone that works for a larger firm on Wall Street that their only environment was a production dev database, or sorry, a production database, no dev database. Everything they were doing was touching exactly production database.
I'm going to say something real quick. That's freaking whack. For small businesses that literally don't even have e-commerce, who have business card websites, we have a dev server for them while it's being developed. It gets decommissioned later, but like still, that's whack.
Nuts. It's absolutely insane. And what does that do? It slows you down because any change you make can affect your entire company. So you got to be 100% sure that any SQL query that you do or any SQL query that you write is fucking perfect. Like, it is nuts. And this is like my junior engineer came into this company and that was his environment. Imagine that. Like that. And people will call me a liar. I've had people literally attack me on X for saying this story because they're like, it can't be real. Like, you're making shit up just for clicks. 100,000% real. I saw it with my own eyes. It is nuts. After that whole conversation, they have fixed it, to be fair. They got a dev environment. But like for several months there, as my friend was being a junior on the team, that was his life. And again, don't do that. But having said that, even a dev database can be a little bit tricky. Like if you have one dev database, one production database, because when you're building features, a lot of times you're, doing stuff on the database that might not be good for like a different developer. So you have to be super careful. You have to have a local database. If your database allows branching, then essentially what you can do is for any feature that you're building, you just create another branch of the database, seed it with some data, and then you have your own production caliber database ready for you to go. And then you just merge that branch in when everything's working and it goes seamlessly into any of the environments that you have. Branching databases, stuff that I've used is PlanetScale. I believe Neon has branches now, and Supabase also has branching available for databases. There's probably more, but branching for databases is super awesome. It's like a really quick way to spin up a database off of one that you're already using and kind of control that structure just like you would with a Git project. Ideas should be able to go from concept to production in potentially days and weeks rather than many, many months of back and forth. Now, before you attack me, the caveat here is, of course, there's some features. If you're building an entire Google Maps infrastructure, it's not going to be in weeks or months, right? Like that's not going to happen. This might be like 6 months plus, might be years, even if you're building at breakneck speeds. I understand that. I'm more specifically talking about the situation that I had before where you're like, I need to add a button here. Can we do that? Those kinds of changes. Yes, they should have some checks and balances in place. You shouldn't be adding buttons willy-nilly, but you should be able to get like all the approvals back and forth within like a week or two, right? And have that button in. That shouldn't be a problem, right? That's more the stuff that I'm talking about. Maybe adding like a little feature that's a little bit more involved, but regardless, it's not something like infrastructure core heavy that takes 6 months even at breakneck speeds. I'm more talking about like you're just adding a feature to your product that should, from a dev perspective, would only take you a couple days to build. Let your customers tell you when the idea sucks as quickly as possible. Matt mentioned this. You're building crazy amount of work put in, right? You're making it perfect. You get it out there and the customer's like, well, this flow sucks. Like whatever you've built here, just bullshit. And you spent, 3, 4, 5 months building this thing and it's perfect. In your eye, like technologically it's perfect. Your designer thinks it's perfect, but the customer's telling you it's shit. And the customer is mostly right in a lot of these things because they're the ones that are going to be complaining to you, regardless of how perfect you think it is and how well you've thought it out in your head and how well your designers have designed it and implemented it. It's just the reality of our industry where like sometimes we just overlook things because we're too close to it. And the faster you can get your idea to your customers and the faster they can tell you it sucks, the less money you've wasted, the less time you've wasted. The faster you can get them the idea and they tell you it's good, the more time you can invest in that idea, right? And make it better. Because that feedback, whatever, like customers usually will be like, oh, I fucking love this, but I wish it had X. Or I really, really enjoyed, like, I really like this feature, but it's missing this little, one more button over here. And then you're making it better instead of just, ideating in your own head consistently and trying to get it perfect in your eyes. It's not about you. It's about the customer. This does not mean launching half-baked broken features. I've touched on this, right? Like, we're not talking about breaking things for the sake of breaking them just because we're trying to move fast. QA should 100% still be part of the process, right? Like, if you're adding a button, even if it's just a button, you should still have someone run through it that's not a developer and tell you if that button has been implemented correctly before you give it to a customer, right? What I'm trying to tell you is that having a QA process should be that. It should just be like, okay, we finished the feature, let the QA look at it. That process should be like, if it's a button, it should take you a QA engineer or a QA project manager, whatever, whoever's doing your QA, it should take them like 5 minutes, right? That's what I'm talking about. A lot of times, if you add the QA process as like a traditional process with a QA team, that process alone, the back and forth between the project manager and the QA team to set up the QA, the process between the engineer and the QA team to get them the environment, that could be like a day or two of work just to get a button to a QA engineer. From personal experience, I've been on teams where that's been the case, okay? And although processes are great, if the process is adding multiple days to something that could take 5 to 10 minutes, you're doing it wrong. You need to remove processes in that situation. You need to make it more agile, make it more personal with the QA team. The QA team needs to be involved in the process of, like, even the argument that I've had made to me, and I'm not sure if I'm 100% on board with this argument, but I can see where it's coming from, is that a good QA person is almost like a good product manager. They need to understand what the product is trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish to be able to provide good QA. And that might be a little bit too extreme in my eyes, but I can see the value in that. Because if the QA engineer or the QA person, or even if it's just the PM that's doing QA, is part of the process of like ideating the idea of this feature, it's going to be a lot easier for them to then test it, right? And if they're part of the process of like giving you feedback on where it should go and how it should work, again, they're more involved, they're more invested in testing it. So there's some sort of middle ground there that I think would be really, really cool. But essentially what I'm saying is that QA, for the sake of process, needs to be very streamlined. Otherwise, it can become a whole blocker for you releasing features.
I have a question about this. So there's an example, and I'm saying this from memory, so don't quote me on the specifics, but this is going to sound out of left field, but the Xbox companion app, or the Xbox app on the phone, the mobile app specifically, it was like really kind of fully featured back when the Xbox One was a thing. And then when the Xbox Series came out, they released sort of a revamped version of the app. And it was really cut down. Like, a lot of the features were missing, and it was sort of like, this is our new design language, this is the direction we want to go. But it had cut out a lot of the features, and I, did some digging, was like, hey, how do I do this? How do I do that? Things I was doing in the past. And people were saying like, oh, like, that those features are coming. What do you think about that in this particular case? Like, I mean, technically speaking, it's less to QA, right? You're almost like taking away the old house and like building a new one there, but instead of it being a 2-story house, you built a 1-story house kind of thing, right? It's like less square footage of like space, just straight up. So like, what do you think on that front? Like, to me, that's a step backwards, and I just kind of thought it was sort of like a cop-out, and it just kind of sucked. It's like, oh, I can't do this now. And if that's the direction that the app is going, then that's the direction the app is going. But it's not going that direction. It's gone back with new design language, and then it will be able to do the things that I was able to do with it before, just at some undisclosed date in the future. And I just kind of thought, I've seen other apps do that and other websites and stuff. I kind of thought that was a little bit strange. Like, what do you think about that? Like, is that a part of building fast?
It kind of is. It definitely kind of is. And I'll explain where I kind of stand on that. I do believe in analytics-driven design. And I think creating, like, when you're first creating your first app, a lot of times you're going to put in stuff that's you think is cool, that's useless, that other people think is cool, that's kind of useless, that, you're putting in a bunch of stuff in here. So maybe with the Xbox Companion app, they put in a bunch of things. And we put it out there for people to use, and people kind of liked it, and they saw the analytics coming in. My guess is, and this is where, like, it's a little bit controversial. Maybe they didn't do this, but they should have. This is how I would have done it. The next version of the app, what you do is you take a look at the analytics and you're like, okay, well, obviously these features are being used the most. These features are kind of being used. Maybe we have a potential to make them used more because they're already being used. Maybe they're kind of buried or something. Maybe we can up them. But these features are pretty much not being used at all. Like the analytics should tell you that. Like that's a very like easy analytics picture that you can generate from any sort of analytics platform that you integrate with. The next version that you come out there with should have emphasis on the features that people love and make it easier to even use those features. Again, bring maybe the features that you think will do well from the features that were kind of like secondary to the forefront as well, to see which one of them is going to be like taken and used just as much as those main features. And again, potentially drop the features that aren't used at all or used very little. Now, how do you do this in the correct way is like, it's not just analytics. You got to probably do customer stories, ask your customers before you make a big decision like that. Announce things as your like dev logs, as you're going and being like, hey, this is our next version that we have planned. Here's the features that we want to, continue and emphasize because we see that you're using them a lot. Here's the features that we don't want to even touch, and allow for a feedback loop. Allow for customers to tell you, no, hell no, I used that feature that you're going to cut. Please leave it in there. Allow for that process to happen, and then iterate and create the app without those useless features that you design in V1. Because again, I'm of the mindset that like, no matter what you do on your V1, you're going to make things shitty, like in some way, shape, or form. And that's okay, because in V2, you can refine that. It's the V2 refinement process that needs to be pretty quick and needs to have this same mentality of build fast and have that feedback loop involved so that you're not alienating majority or like even like not even a majority of customers. You're not alienating your most important customers, the ones that are willing to give you feedback. You know what I mean? And that would be a whole big problem. So I agree with their direction where like they probably took out those features probably because they weren't being used that much. But maybe their communication and their iteration wasn't on point, because you said that they were going to bring them back, which is, in my eyes, like, why? If you remove them from MVP of V2, like, why would you even like communicate why you removed them? Don't tell customers you're going to bring them back. And if they didn't bring them back in a quick enough time, then they failed because they've communicated incorrectly and they failed at execution. So it's a whole failure on that part. But removing features, I don't think is a problem.
Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show notes and in the show description.
I agree with that. Like removing, you should be, sort of trimming the fat, if you will, especially if someone's not using something. Like it's just eating up more, it's another place where an error could happen. It's another place that needs to be maintained if it's something that does need to be maintained and things like that. And it's just sort of like, why have this here? They may as well get rid of it. But you are also correct in that it's very bizarre that they would cut it out and then just be like, hey, but it's coming back. Don't worry. So it's like, oh, okay. Like it's that to me, and I don't work there, so I don't know, but that to me screams, hey, we didn't have time to do this, new design screen for this thing. And so we just sort of just cut it and we'll get to it when we get to it. Like we just didn't have time to do all this. And I get it. Like, I mean, it's a big company and there's a lot going on, especially during a hardware launch, I'm sure, as there was, but I thought it was a weird way to handle it.
Yeah, probably could have been handled much better. Okay, so next thing here is building fast usually means keeping the team that's building it as small as possible. That's the reality. The more people you add, the more stakeholders you add, the more input you add. Again, that initial example I had was 7 different teams trying to approve a button. That's what's going to slow you down. So what does this mean? This means that for whatever feature you're building, for whatever app you're building, you keep the team lean. And from the developer's perspective, you keep it as lean as you possibly can without much bloat. So you might need 2, 3, 4 developers depending on what you're building, but you don't add another 3 developers because you think it's going to make things faster. You only add those developers if it's absolutely necessary to complete the project in the time scope that you have. Okay. That's the kind of mindset you have to have with developers. But not only developers, you have to think about the project manager, right? And the QA that I was talking about. So ideally for me right now on a small team, the project manager needs to kind of be a product owner as well. As soon as the project manager becomes the product owner, what happens is that they no longer need to have full approval from the CEO, CTO, or whatever to go a direction. As long as they have the sign off on what features and what the app's going to be, or what your feature is going to be, then they have autonomy to make the decisions without having to go back and forth within 17 different departments. And that's the key differentiator if you want to make a quick product, a quick change. You need to give your product managers, project managers autonomy. Allow them to not only like make mistakes, but allow them to course correct, allow them to look at the analytics, allow them to complete your vision, right? And then they can then go in and they have a direct line of communication with the developers that are actually doing the implementation, allowing that communication to be very quick. There's no double speak between two different departments. It's just one person that's controlling the direction of the product, and you get to the end and you're good to go. Like, you make a mistake, right? Yes, the product owner might make some mistakes along the way because he didn't get approvals from 13 different sides, but who knows if those 13 different approval steps would make the same mistakes or not. It's a very questionable thing. So allowing them to make a mistake and then allowing the process to iterate quickly on. Again, the process is all about that iteration, is like, yes, make a mistake, but the feedback loop and the iteration loop needs to be just as quick. So when a customer notices that something is broken, or a customer notices that something is inefficient, you need to be able to put that into production very quickly for this process to actually work. Because like you said, like Matt was saying, if the people just say, oh, it's coming soon, it's just going to leave a bad taste in your mouth. It's not possible to do. So allowing for quick iteration is really key. And to do that, you need a smaller team. Less processes as well will help you build faster. And what does that mean? That's a big one for me, is like, I like Agile and Scrum workflows, like, stand-ups and retrospectives and all that. Like they do serve a purpose. And I think in a modified way, they are definitely what we use. Like internally, we use a modified version of Agile and Scrum. What we don't do is have very strict structure around our like retrospectives, around how we assign tasks, around how we like assign story points to everything. Because the more processes you add, right, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to increase velocity. What you're going to do is you're going to make the team more focused on closing tickets to pad their stats so that the next retrospective doesn't go badly for them, versus actually owning the feature that they're building and completing it. That's the real full on 100% how it's going to go. If you focus on like, oh, how many story points did engineer X complete, rather than did the product get out on time, is the product good and built well, you're going to make it so that they start min-maxing the points that they're completing. They're going to start arguing every single ticket that's assigned to them, saying that it's too many points or too little points, and that whole process is going to just bog up the entire team, just flat out. So you need some processes. This is where you need to figure it out based on your team, but you need to be okay with flexibility and need to make sure that the processes aren't inhibiting your team from succeeding and making the team just try to like survive a day in the ecosystem rather than just like owning the feature and actually completing it. It's a tough one to gauge because some teams might need a little bit more, some teams might need a little bit less, depending on who's there, how senior everyone is. But it is an important one because the more you have, the worse it can get.
What this all this kind of really comes down to a lot of the time, and I like that you mentioned it, is that this isn't just a, hey, let's go, full speed into a wall, let's panic. This is like, you're taking into consideration like the productivity steps and the sort of office politics steps and things like that, where those things are kind of overshadowed by the like, oh my God, let's go fast. Oh my God, let's go. And it's sort of this panic. But I do have a question in regards to this, is that what is the sort of status with like these type of teams when it comes to sort of like, do you have to be like the Elon quote unquote hardcore to do this type of thing? Because I've seen this sort of idea or, discussion out on the internet where people are, sort of worried when they join a team if they're going to be, am I on call 24/7 without actually being on call, meaning I'm not paid on call, but I better be available, and I better make sure I always have a laptop and an internet connection, and I better have battery, and I can never go anywhere that needs my full attention. You know, I've mentioned this several times on the show, but does that really play a part in this build fast and break things? Like, is it everyone here must be hardcore? You know, if you're working at my company, that's your identity and that's what you do, and, you know, too bad. What would you say to someone who's, you know, maybe afraid of that becoming part of their life, or I guess lack thereof, if they were to join a fast team?
It's a really good point, and it's a very difficult point to manage. But the way I put it is this: you shouldn't have to work on weekends. You shouldn't have to do any of this stuff to be able to be fast. Like, especially on a consistent basis. Is there going to be like a production launch once every couple months or once a month that's going to require a little bit of extra work? Probably. But to compensate that, there should be a way for you to take time off later on in the next week or the week after. So there needs to be a balance. You need to be able to have really intense periods, because I think like the mindset I have here is like you should have ups and downs in your workflow. I think having just a straight boring, like everything just come in, do your ticket, leave at 5 p.m. every day, like, you know, 9 to 5 every day. To me, that's asininely boring. Like, I hate that. I want to have a situation where for a couple weeks, I'm just building stuff. Maybe I leave a little bit earlier. Maybe I start work a little bit later. You know, I have my own schedule. I'm setting it just to complete stuff, but I'm able to like have my own, you know, process for that, because we're just building in build phase, right? No one cares about the hours. You just want the output. Then during like QA and production, like the week leading up to production, maybe it gets super intense, and maybe I stay for a couple hours later after that, after work, just to get stuff done. And then as soon as production's done, you fix stuff, and then you go back into build phase. So I like the up and down aspect of it, where I have a little bit more autonomy. And again, it needs to be balanced, where you cannot have it where you carry over from one production period to another on a consistent basis, where you're like pushing your team so hard that you're making them work extra hours from like, you know, multiple weeks in a row. Not good. You need to have periods that allow them to, first of all, take time off, obviously, because if you're just inconsistently in production build mode or production deployment mode, no one can take any time off, which is crazy. And B, you need to have them so that they have their own autonomy and are able to compensate for that extra time that they've put in during those production periods, so that they can kind of have a couple weeks of, yes, they're working full time, but if they need to go, you know, if they want to start work a little bit later, or if they need to leave a little bit later, it's not going to affect anything. That's a personal thing. That's how I like to work, and that's how kind of I build my teams. I tell them that up front. I'm like, hey, like, you don't have to work on weekends. If you can't work on weekends, like even during a production like crazy period, no one's going to hold that against them, like, period. Like, that's not going to be something that's going to be mentioned on like a review, right? But there's going to be some more intense periods, and there's going to be less intense periods, and how you use that is up to you.
Yeah, so it's more like a job to get the job done. Like you said, it's not the monotony of like, you better do your 3 tickets a day or whatever the numbers are. Well, the tickets too, like, start becoming, I think you mentioned this a little bit, but they start making what I used to call mini games, where people start like looking for like, oh, I get assigned 2 tickets, but I need to do 5. So I need to, you know, grab 3, and I'll sign in early to try to get the easy ones. And it's just sort of like, okay, well, now we're doing mini games. We're not actually benefiting, you know, the company too much, or like, not that you need to be like beholden to the company, you know, in that way or something like that, but it's just sort of like, you don't wake up early to like choose the lowest hanging fruit and like your yard work on the weekend. You know what I mean? Like, it's, you have to cut the grass, and you have to do this, and you have to do that. Like, now your property looks nice. You're not like, well, I did my 5 tickets, but the grass still hasn't been cut in 6 weeks. You know, it's, you know, it starts getting silly. Like, it starts getting to these like little mini games you're playing with yourself, or in this case with your coworkers, and it falls apart. Like, it's not good. Like, I've definitely been there. I've definitely done things to pad my stats to make it look better. Like, always, like, of course, especially if that's all the management gets. It's like, well, I better have my stats. I better have some overtime on that timesheet. That was a classic one. I better stay till 6 instead of 5, so that now it looks like, hey, look, Matt works an extra hour. And I am, like, I'm not, you know, screwing around. But it was like, technically speaking, the company didn't need it, right? Like, the company didn't need me to be there that extra hour. Sometimes they did. But you don't want to be like, oh, it was an intense period last week, 6 hours overtime, and then this week was not intense, So I'm going to have 6 hours less, but like, is the boss going to see like a big red -6 in their admin portal? Well, better see that 6 hours at least, or better do a 7. And then, it starts getting out of control again. You start doing these mini games and it's a mess. It's a big old mess.
That's exactly, what we want to avoid, and a big red flag for me is when someone's like, we need to start tracking how many tickets someone is doing. That to me means that we're going the wrong way. As a company, as management sphere, like that, if it's getting to the point where like we just don't trust someone to be able to do the work, right? It shouldn't be about how many tickets they can do. We should start looking at a different way to evaluate and be like, hey, are they just not hitting deadlines on a consistent basis? And that's it. If that's the case, what's their reasoning? Maybe it's legit reasoning. Like maybe they're just like, you're giving them too much, so you have to adjust that. You know what I mean? Like it's not. I really don't like let's put these metrics on people so that we can track their progress. We need to be better at tracking people's progress. I speak from a small team perspective, and that's where I want to stay. I want to be very clear here. I'm not talking about from a corporation perspective where you're managing 18 different teams of 30 developers each. It's a different world. I don't personally want to live in that world, and I don't personally want to like participate in that world, so I don't speak to that world. I like smaller teams. I like managing developers that have their own kind of mindset of ownership. And if someone isn't performing well, it's usually very clear. I don't need a ticket system to be able to decide that.
That is super interesting, because I was thinking myself that, and I had this problem actually when I was doing co-op interviews, that one thing I did like was a bigger team, just because I liked having different people tell me different things, right? Like this guy would be like, this is 100% what you do with the servers. And, I'm new, so I'm not going to like necessarily question it. But in your head, sometimes you're like, is that? And then, if you have maybe 10, 12 people on your team or multiple teams involved, you can kind of go to someone else and just ask and be like, hey, like this person says it's this way. And I know that works, but is that the only way, right? You kind of word it in that way, and then you can have multiple sort of mentors. But it can very quickly become, in the real world, in the production world, I guess, it can very quickly become sort of a too many cooks in the kitchen situation. And then now you have too many people, and it has to be slow, right? And in the context of this episode, it has to be slow and it has to be a problem. And no, I get it. Like it's interesting to hear from the different teams, and I would actually love to hear people's feedback, in the Discord or in DMs or something on, if they, like you, the listener, if you work at a place that is a big, slow team for good reason, why is that, and do you like it? And why do you like it? Like, do you like the stats game? Punch in, punch out, 5 tickets a day or whatever it is, 1 ticket a week, whatever, again, depending on your job, boom, 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 quickly. Is that what you like, and why? You and I we're a small team, obviously, for our web dev agency. And then we've worked with small teams for the majority of the time that we've worked with things. Or even if we're working for a big company, our contacts are like, 3 people in this huge company. So it's a small team. So it'd be interesting to see the other side of the coin.
So we've kind of covered over what is building fast. Why is it okay to break things? Right? That's a big question. I think Matt's going to have a lot of feedback here, because he's not a huge fan of breaking things, as we just discussed. But essentially, most of the time when you're first building a product, your user base will be quite small, and making something perfect isn't going to benefit non-existent users. So from a first perspective, if you're building a startup or a small product, the idea that you need to make it perfect will inevitably kill that product, just flat out. You need to put something out there for people to use and start building the user base to get that feedback to pivot into whatever it is you're going to be making. That's the reality. A lot of times, whatever you make first is just that first attempt, and you need to be okay with making big pivots, making adjustments, and building that product that's actually going to succeed. Building a product in a echo, or not even echo chamber, in like just silence, and getting it out there and putting it out there and hoping for success is not a guaranteed failure, but very difficult to pull off. You need to have that. You need to have people using your product, period. And the faster you build it, the faster you can get it in people's hands. Early adopters, like the first people that are going to be using your product, are typically okay with having bugs. As long as you give them the ability to contact you directly right from the app, and you respond very quickly to their feedback. This is what I was talking about earlier, that iteration loop. That feedback loop needs to be part of this process. It's not something you build on the side. This is part of the process. Like if you're building things fast and you're expecting things to break, you need to make it very easy for your customers to tell you something's broken. And you need to respond quickly to their concerns. Okay, whether it be like, oh, that's not actually broken, that's how we intended it, or hey, we're on it, we're fixing it, we fixed it. You need to be very, very involved in that process if you're going down this route, right? I'll say this from personal experience. Some of our most loyal users on the apps that I'm building currently are the ones that reported an issue in the first few weeks that it was out, and we were able to address those issues in 24 hours. And they've continued to use our products from the start till that time. And they've continued to provide good feedback, and they've continued to evangelize for the product, because we had that great feedback loop with them. And we did an imperfect product. It had issues, 100%. And this is, again, it's not just me. This is something that's completely backed up by larger startups like Ping.gg by Theo. He had the exact same experience where some of his early adopters that experienced issues, those issues were solved. I think there's a couple of metrics I think he used. Like a couple of them were solved in like 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And those users have maintained their like top package with Theo from the start because he addressed their feedback quickly. And he allowed his dev team to be able to do that through the architecture that he's chosen, the processes that he's put in place or not put in place, right? The QA kind of system that he had. And again, like it's a proven method. If you talk to your customers, if you allow that feedback to happen, it's going to make better customers, not piss them off. There's probably a point of like, contention where like, yeah, if you have way too many bugs, no amount of feedback loops is going to help you. So you still need to have a QA process. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying small little edge case bugs, they're opportunities for you to build a relationship with a customer. A lot of the time, if you focus on perfection, the feature you're building might not even be viable. So we've talked about this a few times. The extra weeks or months wasted on that calendar feature for your random application that doesn't need a calendar could be wasted time, right? You need to put stuff into production any way possible to test out the viability of the feature before you invest months into something that could have been done quickly, right? And you could do that multiple different ways. Like you don't have to, like maybe if you think a calendar feature might be good, maybe you just integrate with Calendly. That could be your first step. If it's gangbusters, everyone loves it, maybe then you invest some time into building it custom because it might save you some money. But the initial integration is not going to cost you much, and the opportunity cost is going to be much higher rather than the development cost. Once the feature is proven to be wanted or usable, again, you can invest all the time you want into making it robust and perfect. Even then, I would do it in an iterative process where I wouldn't you have this calendar feature that everyone loves and they're using Calendly. Get another calendar feature out there for people to use maybe in beta alongside your Calendly integration so that people can give you feedback, iterate on that, and then remove Calendly when it's not needed anymore, essentially. So I have that iterative process even when perfecting your application. And then again, I just wanted to reiterate this because I talked about it a couple of times, but being responsive to users is way more important than building a slow, perfect product. Okay? That's something you need to get into your head because again, Matt discussed earlier, like he had that issue with Microsoft, with Xbox, the Xbox Companion app. If they had been more communicative and responsive and quicker to iterate on those things that he didn't have, I guarantee you he would have had a different experience. Guaranteed.
It would have been a no mention today. Like I wouldn't have even thought of it, really, realistically, right? And it's like, this is years later. And obviously I'm not like taken aback by it or something, but it is something I remembered being like, if I ever run an app, I don't know if I would do that.
Exactly. And when is it not okay to build fast? So I mentioned at the start of this that I'm going to talk about this part where like, okay, break fast and build fast and break things is good, but there is a limit to that. Authentication and user data collection and storage. I want to really emphasize this right from the get-go. There are way too many instances of companies leaking data, like way too many instances of massive corporations of any size leaking data that could potentially harm the users of that company. It's just constant. Like if you go and check if you've been pwned, there's a website called Have You Been Pwned. have I been pwned. We'll add a link to the show notes. You can see which companies, which leaks your data was leaked in if you just type in your email address that you use for logins. It is way too prevalent. This part of the industry is way too prevalent, and you should never build these systems quickly. This isn't a small team with like one QA round and you get it out the door. This is something that you architect, you implement, you test, you audit, maybe even get a pen test, a second audit, and you make sure that you've done everything you possibly can with the means that you have to prevent your customers' data from leaking, because this is bullshit. This part of the industry is absolute and utter bullshit. It shouldn't be happening. It makes me really angry. So I wanted to get that. I wanted to get this conversation in because it can happen. Like, okay, even with all of that that I've just said, even if you go through all those rounds of testing, it can still happen. But you better have the receipts ready for what you've done to prevent it from happening, is all I have to say. And they better match up the intent. You can shift this responsibility to third parties. So again, like I mentioned with the calendar integration, there's third parties that handle authentication, that are known for this, that have been tested, that have been audited, that have been pen tested, that have everything already done for you. And then you can still build fast and break things, right? As long as the customer data, you're not storing the customer data, you're relying on a third party to do the authentication and storing of customer data. You don't have to worry about that part. You're outsourcing that part to a company that's thoroughly done their research and done the implementation. And then you can build fast and break things on the other stuff that you're working on. So this doesn't necessarily have to slow you down, especially not initially. You can use third-party services like Clerk or Supabase. They've been tested. Like I'm pretty confident to recommend them. Like I think Clerk had an incident where there was a potential issue, but they were very upfront about it. They put it out there and no one was affected, right? Like I can trust Clerk because I know their communication process is pretty good. They've had an incident, but there wasn't any data leaked. And they were very communicative even about that. Supabase, I haven't heard anything bad about them. They're very widely used and they have their own authentication system and storage of data. So pretty confident recommending that. Building on top of established features in established software is another place you probably don't want to build fast. And this goes back to the very beginning of this conversation where Matt mentioned Windows. If you're going to be building on top of Windows and you're going to be changing the start menu of Windows, and that crashes 15 million computers because you didn't test properly, that's going to have a severe impact on your customers, severely bad. Any infrastructure established feature that that your company maintains, that needs to be treated with white gloves. Any change to it needs to go through every round of testing you could possibly do to make sure that any negative impact affects the smallest amount of people possible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another example would be like Google Search. Like if you're adding a feature to Google Search, you better make damn sure that it doesn't actually affect the impact of Google Search, right? Like if someone can't search and the advertising doesn't show up, you're kind of like, Google's done. Like they're not doing too well right now without that, right? Like you could be costing your company millions, billions of dollars if you screw that up without a way to revert back, right? So the idea here is that infrastructure stuff needs to be architected in a way that, yes, allows for slow development of that part, but allows also for iterative development on the features on top of it. So again, the example with the Windows would be like, if you want to update the calculator app, it shouldn't require you to update Windows completely to update the calculator app. You should be able to just update it from the App Store, right? And then again, like the calculator app shouldn't crash Windows. The weird thing is that I'm pretty sure Windows ME had a situation where the calculator app actually did crash Windows. So I could be talking from that perspective. I'm fairly certain that that something like that did happen, but I think at this point we can be pretty confident the calculator app in Windows isn't going to crash anything. But stuff like that, like features built on top of Windows, shouldn't affect the core infrastructure of Windows enough to actually warrant the crazy amount of investment you have to do to build slowly on established software.
Well, I don't remember which Windows it was, whether it was ME or 2000, but one of those was a absolute friggin' disaster, if I do say so myself, to the point where like, and I'm a Windows guy, and I was like, I'm all right. I don't need to be using that. And I was fine with Vista, and people hated Vista. So
Vista was fine. It was just didn't run well on slow computers. That's it. Like that was literally its only knock.
It's like, oh, this arrow theme doesn't run well on my computer from like the 1600s.
I don't understand the hate for Vista, honestly. Like, you could still use XP at that time without any issues. Like,
was it the first era of confirm or deny, approve or deny or whatever, giving permissions? Maybe.
But yeah, that's it. That's it for build fast and break things. Go out there and build fast and break things responsibly, please.
I do have one other thing to add to your when is it not okay to build fast? And then I have a question for you as well. When is it not okay to build fast? When it's a matter of life and death. Do not build fast and break things. Build, test, ask your peers, make sure things are good, do your due diligence. Because if it's literally a matter of life and death, you can't be like, well, my heart meter crashed just because, you're supposed to hit the button twice, even though I told you to hit it once. It's like, probably should have looked at that, not good. So if you're doing something that's like life and death or danger, like if it's going to put somebody in danger or something like that, make sure it's good. Same with financial systems, like a bank or something like that. That's going to put people in danger, right? And they need money, need to pay bills, whatever. Make sure if you're doing that, like even Mike and I've said a million times, we're not going to be working on any bank apps anytime soon because not good like that. There's a lot of security involved and that type of thing, and like I don't want to be dealing with that because that's going to be a whole other situation that we just do not want to get ourselves into. Just because, and we can admit it, we're not that aware of like all the things that you would need to do for a bank app, like all the security things, the regulations, which are security based and other regulations as well, and too much. So it's like, don't build those fast. And if you don't know how to build those type of things, don't build them. Like, try to learn how to build them from somebody. Do not just be like, yeah, I know what I'm doing. And then just, be the guy who lied on their resume and then be like, yeah, and, none of my heart meters work. Like, no, good. Not good. Not good.
I would also recommend not coding your pacemaker in JavaScript.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah, just FYI, just don't be using that technology. Like, I love JavaScript and TypeScript. No way am I coding any embedded systems with it. No chance, 0.0001% chance that I'm ever touching embedded systems that are life critical, like an airbag with TypeScript, missing a freaking a declaration or something, and someone just explodes into smithereens. No, thank you. I want my compiler to do all of the error checking for me, please.
Yeah, like, what was the one rover or something like that didn't boot up that we sent to Mars? Like NASA or somebody sent a rover to Mars years ago, and then I remember our teacher in school said that what they had done was, since it was embedded programming, you write most of your programming inside of a while one loop, which is like a death loop for many sort of programs. But for embedded, it's very common you do that, but they forgot to exit it in a certain way or something like that. So it just kept saying like, boot up, boot up, boot up, boot up. And it's just on Mars. And you're like, oh God, like, what do you do? Like, send a man out there with like a USB stick? Like, what do you do? Like, you're done at that point. So like, that's another area of like, it's not net life and death. Like, it was a robot, but I know it was a mistake, but like, make sure you do your QA when you need to. I would like to ask a question of you though, Mike. So like, said a million times, I work with the small to medium business guys a lot, and a lot of my time is spent with the small to medium business clients that we have, basically. And we'll like really slowly go through things, and I don't mean super slowly, like I'm asking 4 people for approvals and things like that. One of the things I try to do with them is, if they have a website already, and usually what ends up happening is their website's a mess, whether it's due to age, but more commonly it's actually due to them having rushed into it the first time, right? Their content's a mess. They didn't have a lot of budget. They sprung features on their developer last minute. Like, we had one guy that sprung this feature on us where like 3/4 way through development, he was like, well, I need to have like full course, e-commerce. And then they took like airline software, ticket software, and they like modified it, and he wasn't happy with it. But like, clearly that's because it was last minute and they didn't have the budget or time or whatever to sort of figure out a solution for him specifically. And so one of the things I try to do is I try to get them to go slow. And I don't mean to literally weeks and weeks of doing nothing. I mean, take your time, make it good, so then when we ship it, it's good, right? This partially comes from my craziness, where when I see an email, I usually freak out and have to, deal with it. I don't like to leave the task at hand, for too long. But I also have this sort of thing where small businesses like don't have a large budget. And a lot of the time, they also don't have a lot of time either. Like, they're busy doing, whatever it is they normally do. If their website is just, a marketing arm for their other business, right? And I guess the question at that point is it's like, if their site does go down and they lose $400 worth of sales, you might think, well, it's only $400, but to them, that's not good. Like, that's really not good, right? And so I often will recommend, like, hey, go with somebody like a Shopify, or like go with, one of these other services. Take your time looking at the services, look through them, make sure the features are good, contact their sales department, get a demo, like make the decision. And then in a way, it's almost like they slowly make the decision. And then once the decisions are made, then they can go fast. I don't know if that's like foolish or what, because like these are small businesses. At the end of the day, a lot of these people aren't going to suddenly, become homeless or something if something goes down, and there's no life and death situation usually, right? And so it's very much just like, go fast. And even if they are freaking out, like I find a lot of small businesses, if their site's down, they will freak out like, oh my God, this is the end of the world. But then you look at the stats and they get like three users a day, and it's like not even that big of a lead generation thing. So what do you think on that sort of side of things? Is when, obviously breaking things does cost money. Time is money, right? But also you're going fast, so that makes up for some of that time. But there's just so little time and so little budget when it comes to those small to medium business clients in many cases.
So a couple things here. One thing in my eyes would be, I think giving too much time and choice to small business clients is a mistake. I think they need to be under pressure to complete whatever they've assigned you to complete. I think like specifically them, like you're under pressure because you're getting paid to do this. I think you need to put the small business people under pressure for getting the decisions that are absolutely necessary done, right? And what I mean by absolutely necessary is like most of the decision-making process in this space should be on the technical side. What platform should we use, stuff like that. That decision should be just made and given to them. They can accept it or not, that's fine, but they need to be in charge of the business side because that's what they are. They're in the business of it. And that's it. So they need to be shown how to manage their site, whether it's Shopify or not. I think that's more of a technical decision that you have to own without input from them. And what I mean by that is like, obviously you're going to tell them what you're going to be doing, but if you give them the choice of like, oh, we can go WooCommerce with these 10 reasons, or we can go Shopify with these 10 reasons, or we can go with custom with these 20 reasons, that right there is analysis paralysis for a customer. And that will slow down the entire process immediately, no matter what. So less choice, right? Do your best to kind of guide them to a quick decision on any choice that is necessary, because some choice will have to be done. And then the next part of this is like you're saying that downtime costs them money, 100%. So again, the infrastructure that you design for them, it needs to account for that. And what, again, quick, being able to restore a backup quickly, alerts on if a page is down. Those two things will allow you to alienate any downtime, in my opinion. So yes, you can make mistakes. Yes, the site can go down, but as long as you can restore those mistakes quickly and be alerted of those mistakes, it allows you to be more iterative and faster. So that's where like this choosing the right infrastructure or tech stack for this kind of method comes into play.
And that's a good point for those that have a budget, right? And that's the thing is that like we work for many people that their budget is just way too low. And so, we build a website, we install it, it works, but then we're not doing maintenance for them. We're not doing maintenance. We're not doing that uptime check. We're not doing this and this, that, and the other thing to help them sort of moving forward. And then that like almost, we won't get into the whole conversation again, but this kind of loops back into our conversation from another recent episode where it's like, sometimes a budget is just too low, right? Where it's just like, hey, for $20 a month, I'm not willing to monitor your site and get those emails about downtime, because if I get the email about downtime, I have to like take time out of my day, go fix it, whatever. Maybe there's like an SLA or something like that, a guarantee of 24 hours, 72 hours or whatever, but I'm doing it for $25. Like it just doesn't, it doesn't compute, especially when there may be multiple sites involved, especially if you're an agency. And so it's interesting to hear that there's like sort of like that way to be agile at the small to medium business range. But again, there's just that fine line of like, some of these businesses have, a couple $1,000s, and like, that's just not enough, right? And so I have like, not a counter question, but like another question is, one of the things that we've been doing quite a bit of recently is actually just consulting. So I'll bring up to people, I'll say, what's your budget? And sometimes they won't tell you. And I know that that's a strategy, a negotiation strategy, where they want you to make the first move. And if they won't tell me, I assume it's low. So what I do is I tell them, okay, an average website of this size will be, just making this up, will be $5,000. And that'll be on the higher end of whatever it is they're asking for, let's say. Usually that scares them. And it's like, oh, okay. And then I'll say to them, wait, there's ways to lower it. There's ways to do this. There's ways to do that. Or I can play a more consulting role here where I can come in, play the consultant, and help you. So you said like that giving a lot of options is a bad idea. And I agree with that, with analysis paralysis. But what I've been doing recently is giving them a lot of options. But then there's a big section here, is that I tell them exactly what the decision they need to make is to reach each conclusion. So for example, I'll say, if you want to sell first, and that's your main number one thing, I recommend Shopify, for example. And again, my suggestions are going to be different for each project, but in this hypothetical, I recommend Shopify. If you want to have a really nice website with lots of marketing and you want to have some e-commerce, I recommend Webflow or like a Squarespace or whatever it is. And so I'm giving them options, but I'm literally saying like, hey, answer this question for yourself. And then I'll give reasons like, you have $1,000. You probably shouldn't go to someone for custom work. You should probably go to someone, where you're in contact with me now. If you get in trouble in Wix or something like that, I can hop in, figure it out, publish it. Webflow, certainly go in there, fix it up for you, kind of fire it out, double check things for you, like upon launch, things like that. I think that has been really helpful. Like, what do you think about that sort of that angle where, like, as the consultant sort of doesn't have to, but that's how I've been consulting.
I think that that's a better place for options. I will say in a similar vein, and I don't know, I don't know if this is better or not, honestly. Like, I think consulting is a very, like, if you know how to do it, you're good. Like, it's, your method is probably just as good as anyone else's. But my thought would be like, maybe reverse it a little bit, where during the initial consultancy period, instead of giving them the options that you're laying out, ask them the questions that would narrow down those options. So get to the point where like you just have like a list of questions like, do they want a better marketing site? Are they focused on e-commerce, etc.? There's like get those questions out of the way and then give them the option that would have led to that question. So again, you're removing the choice from their side by narrowing down the questions. It's kind of a reverse of what you're doing. Again, I'm not 100% sure which one. Honestly, I think perhaps you would use both depending on the client. So some clients like options and some clients don't, especially in consulting. Whereas like a client comes to you and be like, just tell me what to do. Then you ask them the questions and give them the option. And if the client's like, I don't really know what I want and et cetera, and I kind of want to see the options, and I think that does happen, you give them more of your approach where it's like, you just, hey, in this scenario, you would do this, in this scenario, you would do this. And then maybe they don't even know those scenarios exist, right? So that could be a benefit for them. So I think both could work here. It's just another kind of tool in the toolbox for consultancy.
It's also like a very sort of, we're off the topic of necessarily building fast at this point, but maybe we should have an episode about consulting, but it's also like a per person basis as well, right? Because some people are legitimately very interested and they want to know all the options, and they'll literally ask you like, give me 6 options and things like that. Whereas other people are so overwhelmed just by looking at tech where they're like, hey, I don't even know a website is the thing I need. Like, I've had that question tons of time. Like, do you think I need a website? And sometimes it's no, I think you need a Google My Business card. And I think you need, to make sure that that's up to date. Make sure you constantly, answer Google's questions of, are you open at this time? What are your holiday hours? Those type of things. Be really accurate with it and work on getting some Google reviews and, things like that. There are definitely like consultant level questions, right? And in those cases, you wouldn't give them a million options, because if they're already overwhelmed by looking, or if they don't even know where to look, it sort of becomes like, oh, like what are we doing here? But some people, oh, hey, I haven't been in the website game for 5-10 years, but I used to be. They're not going to get overwhelmed by the options. And maybe that's even like another strength of being a consultant, is like reading the client and being like, this person needs options. This person needs a ton of explanation. That person doesn't. Things like that. But I think that concludes this episode. Before we go, majorly off topic into consulting, I think that concludes this episode, unless you have anything else to add, Mike.
No, I think we nailed it. I think we covered build fast and break things with a little sprinkle of consultancy advice.
We recorded fast, and hopefully this episode will not break.
I kind of hope it will. Let us know, customers. If it breaks for you, reach out to us. We'll fix it quickly. I don't know what it means, but I think it sounds good.
It does sound good. So anyway, that's the slogan for this episode, I suppose. Remember, if you want to support episodes like this so that we can continually repair them, that we are on Patreon. That's patreon.com/HTML, all the things. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons. Tim from The Web Hacker, thewebhacker.com. Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com. Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com. Joshua via silvio.us, and Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. And we'd also like to give a shout out to Michael Araka, a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review in the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media. On Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.